They never meant for you to hear this. The records I'm about to reveal were sealed for over a century, locked in an archive no outsider was supposed to touch. Not because they were fragile, but because they were dangerous. What you're going to learn about Samuel Hawthorne will change the way you see the world, because his story isn't just about one man. It's about the systems that keep you docile, the lies that shape your beliefs, and the hidden forces that watch you every time you think you're alone. Milbrook, Vermont, winter of 1847. The sky had been the color of lead for weeks. Wind screamed through the valleys like something alive. 17 people in the surrounding counties had already vanished into the snow that year. No bodies found. No search party ever returned with more than scraps of clothing and blood-stained ice. And then, on the night of February 18th, in the teeth of a blizzard that could strip flesh from bone, he appeared. A figure walking down from the mountains, upright, unhurried, against winds that bent the trees like green whips. The townsfolk thought they were looking at a ghost, but when he reached them, they realized something far worse. He was alive. They called him Samuel Hawthorne. But there was no Samuel Hawthorne in any census, any church record, any grave registry, anywhere in New England. He spoke English flawlessly, yet no one could place his accent. He carried a satchel made of material no one recognized. His boots left geometric patterns in the snow that seemed deliberate. And he didn't seem to feel the cold. They asked him where he'd come from. He didn't name a town. He didn't name a state. He just said, "Beyond the white fields, where the old ways still guide the wise." That night, he cured a sick child with a black liquid that smelled like pine and something sweet no one could name. By morning, word had spread. The strange, or was a healer. But over the weeks that followed, people began to notice what else he was. A man who never slept more than 2 hours, who vanished into storms no one else could survive, and who watched people the way a hunter watches prey. And that was before the disappearances began. You have to understand the mindset of Milbrook in those days. Isolated, desperate, starving. The people were primed for someone like Samuel Hawthorne. In any other year, they might have questioned him. They might have noticed the cold precision in his eyes, the way he measured each man's strengths and weaknesses when they spoke. But that winter, they didn't want to see. They only wanted to believe. By the third day, Hawthorne had become indispensable. His strange cures worked where Dr. Putnam's medicine failed. A pneumonia that should have claimed a young mother's life broke overnight after she drank one of his herbal infusions. An old logger's frostbitten hands regained movement after Hawthorne massaged them with a salve that smelled faintly of iron. He never asked for money. Instead, he accepted payment in the form of favors, private conversations, and access to people's homes. This was how he mapped the town, not in streets and houses, but in allegiances, fears, and ambitions. He knew who owed debts, who was having affairs, who was secretly planning to leave when the snow melted. He stored it all away. Grace Thornbury, whose daughter Sarah he'd cured of a relentless cough, began keeping notes about him in letters to her sister that she never sent. She noticed his peculiar silences, the way he listened more than he spoke. She wrote about hearing him muttering in a language she didn't recognize, a rhythmic, almost chanting cadence, when he thought he was alone. And she saw the way he stared at the mountains, as though waiting for a signal. One night, she woke to the sound of the kitchen door opening. Hawthorne was gone for hours. The snow was still falling hard, yet when he returned before dawn, there was no snow on his boots, only a faint reddish-brown stain melting into the floorboards. Within a week of that night, the first disappearance occurred. A tray. Her named Elijah Marsh failed to return from checking his lines. The search party found his sled abandoned, his dogs tied up and unharmed. There were tracks leading away from the sled. 2 sets at first, then only 1. The second set was deeper, geometric. Dr. Putnam kept that finding quiet, but in his private journal, he wrote something that was never meant to be read. If Hawthorne is not what he claims, then we are sheltering a predator in human form. Predators don't always strike with teeth and claws. The most dangerous ones move first for the mind. Samuel Hawthorne understood this better than anyone in Milbrook, because he didn't just cure sickness. He cured doubt. After Elijah Marsh vanished, the town should have been on edge. But Hawthorne diffused suspicion with ease. He helped the search party, carrying provisions they swore weighed more than any man could bear, over frozen terrain. He spoke about tragedy with the perfect balance of solemnity and hope. And when the search failed, he was the first to console Elijah's widow, pressing into her hand a small carved talisman shaped like a spiral. For protection, he said. My people have used these for generations. Within days, half the town was wearing those spirals. Around necks, tucked into coat pockets, tied to children's wrists. He said they would align a man with the rhythms of survival. But something else happened. People began to listen to him more readily, defer to his advice, without question. Dr. Putnam, whose education should have made him immune to such superstition, found himself defending Hawthorne in arguments he didn't remember starting. The Reverend Greenfield noted that church attendance was declining, replaced by small gatherings in the Thornbury barn, where Hawthorne spoke of the great cycles and the laws older than God. Hawthorne never shouted. His voice was low, steady, and certain. He didn't try to persuade. He simply stated things as if they were already known truths. He told them that winter was not their enemy. Weakness was. That sickness was not a curse, but a culling, and that survival meant understanding what must be fed so that the rest can endure. One evening, during one of these gatherings, he asked a question that left the room silent. If food runs out, will you feed the strong or the many? No one answered. But the next morning, Grace Thornberry wrote in her unsent letter, I fear he already knows. From that night forward, something subtle shifted in Milbrook. Neighbors who had once shared provisions began to hoard. Parents taught their children to avoid the weakest houses, and Hawthorne watched it all, pale eyes sharp in the lamplight, as if measuring how quickly the change would take root. The disappearances didn't stop. They became easier to explain away. By late February, Samuel Hawthorne's voice carried more weight than the Reverend's sermons and the doctor's warnings combined. It wasn't just respect. It was obedience, quiet and unspoken, but absolute. It began with small things. When he suggested which traps should be checked first, hunters followed without question. When he advised rationing certain supplies, Jeremiah Prescott's store adjusted its ledger as though it were law. He never raised his voice, never issued commands. He simply planted ideas like seeds and waited. The Reverend Greenfield tried to reclaim authority with a sermon about resisting false shepherds. Hawthorne attended, sitting in the back, expression unreadable. When the service ended, he approached the Reverend and placed a spiral talisman in his palm. Witnesses said Greenfield looked shaken, though no one heard what was whispered between them. The next Sunday, Greenfield's sermon was about endurance through new traditions. Grace Thornberry's notes paint the clearest picture of this shift. She wrote of seeing her husband, a man of firm Christian upbringing, speaking to Hawthorne in the barn long after midnight, the lantern burning low. When she asked what they'd discussed, Thomas simply said, "The old ways make more sense now." That same week, another disappearance. This time it was Mary Fairchild, an 8-year-old who had been playing in the snow outside her home. There were tracks, her small boot prints alongside larger ones, leading toward the tree line. No search party was organized. Instead, Hawthorne spoke to the grieving mother in private. By the next day, she was wearing a spiral at her throat and had stopped asking questions. It was then that Dr. Putnam began keeping his own kind of record, not just medical notes, but a ledger of influence. He marked each family that had given Hawthorne shelter, attended his gatherings, or accepted his protection charms. By the end of the month, more than 2/3 of the town was on that list. The transformation wasn't loud. It was glacial, inevitable. People didn't think they were obeying him. They thought they were making their own decisions. That was the true mastery. He never told them what to do. He made them believe they'd already chosen it themselves. And in a winter that would take more than 20 lives before the thaw, those who resisted him were the first to vanish. The confrontation happened on a night when the wind rattled shutters like angry hands, and snow fell so thick the air itself seemed solid. Reverend Greenfield had gathered the remaining few who still resisted Hawthorne's influence. The farmers, the older families, the ones who clung to the church as a lifeline in the storm. They met in the chapel by lamplight, their breath misting in the cold. Greenfield's voice was raw with urgency. "This man is not what he claims. He has no past here, no ties to our land or our God. I fear his cures are not blessings, but bargains." The men and women nodded, but their eyes betrayed hesitation. Hawthorne's medicines had kept them alive. Without him, some knew they'd already be buried under the ice. Halfway through the Reverend's warning, the chapel door opened. Hawthorne stepped inside without hurry, brushing the snow from his strange coat. He didn't remove his boots, didn't bow his head. He walked straight to the center aisle and stood there, looking at each face in turn. The silence was suffocating. "I hear you've been speaking of me," he said, voice low, but carrying to every corner of the room. "That's good. It means you're thinking. But thinking without truth is like walking in snow without knowing what lies beneath." The Reverend stood his ground. "You've brought fear to this town, Samuel. You've led them away from the Word of God." Hawthorne's pale eyes locked on him. "God?" His tone was almost gentle. "If your God fed the strong and left the weak to die, you'd call it cruel. If your God fed the weak and starved the strong, you'd call it merciful. But what do you call it when both are fed? Until there is nothing left." No one spoke. He let the question hang, then reached into his satchel and withdrew a small pouch. He tossed it onto the Reverend's pulpit. Inside was a spiral talisman and something darker, a child's my, 10, stiff with frozen blood. Gasps broke the silence. The Reverend's face went pale. Hawthorne turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "Decide quickly," he said. "The snow doesn't wait for prayer." Then he stepped back into the storm. By the next morning, 3 families who'd been in the chapel had visited Hawthorne's quarters. All left wearing spirals. It began quietly, almost invisibly, the way all dangerous rituals begin. Hawthorne never called them ceremonies. He called them preparations. He said they were to ready the body for the worst of the winter. But to those who participated, it became something more. On the first night of March, under a moon so pale it looked like bleached bone, the Thornberry barn was lit from within. No one outside could see clearly through the frost-rimmed windows, but Grace Thornberry, hidden in the loft above, later wrote what she saw. A dozen townsfolk standing in a circle, each holding a small clay bowl filled with steaming liquid. Hawthorne stood at the center, speaking in that strange, rhythmic language she had once overheard in whispers. He instructed each person to drink, not all at once, but one by one, in silence. When the last had finished, they each took a spiral talisman from a wooden box and pressed it to their lips before fastening it around their necks. Then Hawthorne extinguished the lanterns, leaving only the moonlight. Grace described a sudden shared inhale, as if everyone in the room had drawn breath at the exact same moment, in perfect unison. And then, laughter. Soft at first, then building, until the sound filled the barn. But she said it wasn't joyful. It was the sound of people who had stopped feeling the cold entirely. In the days that followed, those who had attended the gathering began showing subtle changes. They no longer shivered in the wind. They moved through the snow with the same surety Hawthorne did, their boots leaving deeper, more deliberate prints. And they spoke less. They didn't seem withdrawn, just watchful. Dr. Putnam noticed something else. The pulse of those who had taken part in the preparation was slower, steadier, almost unnaturally so. Their skin was warm to the touch, even after hours outdoors. He asked one man, a trapper now, Med Collins, what was in the drink. Collins just smiled faintly and said, "It's not what's in it, doctor. It's what it takes out." By mid-March, the rituals were no longer optional. Those who refused to participate found themselves quietly excluded. From shared meals, from firewood distributions, from help during illness. And soon, those excluded began disappearing. Always at night, always without a sound. It happened on a night when the wind had died completely, leaving the world so still you could hear the snow settling on the rooftops. The barn was full, every lantern lit, the air heavy with the strange herbal scent that clung to every one of Hawthorne's gatherings. This time, he didn't begin with the chanting. He began with a story. He said he had walked from beyond the white fields, but now he gave details, or what sounded like them. He spoke of a land where the sun moved differently in the sky, where the winters were endless, but never cruel, to those who understood the balance. He described cities not built of wood or stone, but of a material like glass that drank in heat by day and bled it back by night. He spoke of rivers that froze from the bottom up, trapping fish alive until they were needed. And then he said something that made even those closest to him shift uneasily. "In my home, we do not bury our dead. We feed them back to the living, so the strong remain strong, and the cycle continues. That is why we never starve." There was no gasp, no protest, only silence. Hawthorne let it stretch until it became a weight on every chest in the room. Then he looked around, meeting every gaze. "Civilization is a lie," he said. "It teaches you that the old ways are savage, but the old ways are the only reason I am here, and the only reason you will survive what is coming." Someone, Grace thought it was her husband, asked him what was coming. Hawthorne's answer was a slow, cold smile. "The deep winter. The one that never ends, and when it arrives, you will thank me for teaching you to feed the right mouths." That night, more than half the town swore themselves to his preparations. They drank from the steaming bowls. They took new spirals, carved from a darker, heavier material than before. And when they left the barn, their footsteps in the snow matched Hawthorne's exactly. Dr. Putnam, watching from the shadows outside, wrote in his journal, "It is no longer a question of whether he will take them. It is a question of when." The snow had eased for 3 days straight, a rare mercy that winter. Roads that had been choked with drifts were now passable, at least for someone desperate enough to risk them. That's when Jonathan Keene decided to leave. Keene was no fool. He had seen the changes in his neighbors, the silence in their eyes, the slow synchronization of their movements with Hawthorne's. He'd lost his wife the previous winter and had no children to keep him tethered to Milbrook. He told no one, not even Dr. Putnam, of his plan. At first light, he packed a sled with enough supplies to reach Bennington, hitched his 2 strongest dogs, and set out along the eastern pass. What Keene didn't know was that Hawthorne had been awake all night, sitting in the Thornberry kitchen, staring out the frost-rimmed window. Grace, who had been stirring the morning fire, saw him rise without a word and pull on his strange boots. He left before sunrise, moving in the direction of the pass. By mid-afternoon, Keene's sled was found abandoned 2 miles outside town. The dogs were still harnessed, unharmed but trembling. The sled's cargo was untouched. Food, tools, blankets, all neatly in place. There were tracks in the snow. Keene's boots and another pair, the deep geometric prints that had become familiar to everyone in Milbrook. The 2 sets of tracks led off the road and into the dense pines. 30 yards in, Keene's tracks stopped. Not faded, not blown over. Stopped. Hawthorne's prints continued for another few paces, then circled back toward town. When word spread, no one confronted him. That evening, he appeared at Jeremiah Prescott's store as if nothing had happened, speaking calmly about the need to preserve resources and respect the balance. He mentioned no names, but when Dr. Putnam asked directly where Keene was, Hawthorne only said, "The snow takes what it's owed. You can't blame Todd. He collector." From that day forward, no one tried to leave. The eastern pass lay untouched, even when supplies dwindled, and in his ledger, Dr. Putnam placed a black mark next to every household that stopped asking questions. Grace Thornberry wrote that night, "It feels as though the storm is no longer outside the town. It's in our homes, in our heads." It started with a list. Not written on paper. Hawthorne didn't need that. It was in his head, and everyone knew it. By late March, the town's food stores were at their lowest point. The supply wagons from the lowlands still hadn't come. The blizzards showed no sign of ending. People whispered about slaughtering livestock that were meant for breeding. Dr. Putnam began cutting rations for his patients. But Hawthorne's people, those who wore the spirals, never seemed to go hungry. He began speaking more openly about feeding the strong, not as a suggestion, but as a natural law. He said it while sharpening tools in the Thornberry barn, while tending the fires at the inn, while mending fishing nets in Jeremiah Prescott's store, always in the same steady, certain voice. When the cold takes the weakest, it feeds the rest. You waste strength when you fight that truth. Then he began naming names, quietly, never in front of the person. Grace overheard him tell her husband that old Mrs. Fairchild was ready to return her warmth to the living. 2 nights later, Mrs. Fairchild was gone. No one asked why her bed was empty. The disappearances became deliberate. A sick logger who couldn't lift his axe in the morning was gone by nightfall. A boy who had fallen through thin ice and survived was found missing from his home the next day. Each time, the same geometric boot prints appeared in the snow, sometimes alone, sometimes alongside the victims. Dr. Putnam confronted him once, asked directly if he was responsible. Hawthorne didn't deny it. He only leaned closer, his pale eyes unreadable, and said, "You cure them for a season, doctor. I cure them forever." By then, the barn gatherings had taken on a darker rhythm. The preparation drink was thicker now, its smell more pungent, almost metallic. The spirals were carved deeper, sharper, from blackened wood that seemed to drink the lantern light. And during the final moments of each gathering, Hawthorne would close his eyes and listen, as if hearing something moving beneath the snow. Grace's notes became shorter, her script uneven. He is choosing for us now, and the others. They're beginning to thank him for it. It was Thomas Rourke who tried. Rourke was a trapper, a man used to killing quickly and without hesitation. He'd lost his sister to the disappearances, found her spiral necklace hanging on the barn door one morning, like an offering. He hadn't joined Hawthorne's gatherings. He hadn't worn the charm. He'd been waiting, sharpening his knife, telling no one. The night he made his move was moonless, the kind of black where the sky and snow were the same color. Hawthorne was alone in the barn, cleaning the long hooked blades he used for skinning game. The lantern on the workbench cast a narrow cone of light, everything else swallowed by shadow. Rourke stepped inside without a sound, the knife held low. He crossed the floor in 3 slow strides and drove the blade deep into Hawthorne's back. Hawthorne didn't fall. Rourke yanked the knife free, expecting blood. There was some, but not much. Too dark, too thick. Hawthorne turned, the motion unhurried, and looked at him with those pale eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "You've wasted your strength," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was almost disappointed. Rourke tried again, slashing for the throat, but Hawthorne caught his wrist with a grip that felt like iron. He leaned in close enough for Rourke to smell the strange, cold scent of him, like snow on metal. "Do you know what feeds the strong more than flesh?" Hawthorne whispered. "The will to fight, taken from the enemy while it's still warm." Rourke's knife clattered to the floor. His knees buckled. Hawthorne let him drop, still breathing, but utterly still, staring at nothing. By morning, Rourke was gone. Only his boots were left, neatly placed by the barn door, with snow already filling them. After that night, no one else tried. Grace Thornberry wrote in her final note on the matter, "He can be cut, but not killed. And maybe that is because he is not meant to live here, only to feed here." The thaw came late that year. Not the gentle melt of spring, but a sudden, almost violent shift, as if the snow had decided all at once that it was finished with Milbrook. Ice cracked from the rooftops. The river, silent for months, roared awake overnight, carrying sheets of broken frost downstream like shattered glass. With the road clear, the first supply wagon from Bennington rolled into town. The driver expected cheers, handshakes, maybe even tears. Instead, he found streets nearly empty. A few figures watched from behind windows, but they didn't wave. They didn't smile. Dr. Putnam was the first to speak with him. The doctor looked thinner, older, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "You should turn back," he told the driver. "There's nothing here for you." But the man stayed. He unloaded sacks of grain, crates of dried goods. As he moved between buildings, he began to notice the spirals, hanging on door frames, carved into thresholds, worn around the necks of nearly everyone he saw. When he asked after familiar names, Keene, Fairchild, Rourke, no one answered. The silence was worse than denial. Grace Thornberry, was one of the few who approached him directly. Her voice was low, urgent. "He'll be gone soon," she said. "He always leaves when the snow does. But when the deep winter comes, he'll be back." That night, the driver saw him. Samuel Hawthorne, standing at the edge of the road that led east, wearing the same strange boots, the same pale expression. Over his shoulder was a satchel that seemed far too light for the season. Their eyes met for a moment. The driver later swore he felt something in that gaze. Not hostility, not even warning. Just recognition, as if Hawthorne knew he'd be telling this story for the rest of his life. By morning, Hawthorne was gone. The snow had retreated from the hills, leaving only the deep, geometric prints in the mud, leading out of town, toward the horizon. Dr. Putnam burned his ledger that day. Grace stopped writing in her journal. And when the next winter came, the spirals were still hanging on every door in Milbrook. It was nearly 12 years before the deep winter came. Long enough for the driver to grow older, for his hair to silver and his knees to ache on the long roads. Long enough for him to start believing the story he'd carried from Milbrook had been exaggerated by memory. A strange winter in a strange town, nothing more. Then the snow came early. October, and already the passes were sealed. By November, the rivers had stopped moving. By December, the sky had settled into a colorless pall, and the cold was not the cold he knew. It was heavier, older. The driver was snowed in at a way station in the Highlands when a caravan of traders arrived from the north. They were frostbitten, exhausted, their sleds half empty. One of them carried a small wooden box, its surface carved with a spiral so deep it seemed to tunnel into the grain. When the driver asked where they'd found it, the man just shook his head. That night, unable to sleep, the driver went out into the yard. The snow was falling straight down, silent and endless. And there, half hidden by the drifting white, was a set of boot prints. Not round like his own, but geometric, the same pattern he had seen outside Milbrook all those years ago. The prints led toward the tree line. Standing there, just beyond the edge of the lantern light, was a figure in a dark coat, watching. Pale eyes, no steam from the breath. The driver didn't call out. He didn't move. The figure raised one hand slowly, almost in greeting, then turned and vanished into the black between the trees. The driver returned to the way station, locked the door, and sat by the fire until dawn. He never told the others what he'd seen, but before the storm swallowed the last of the road south, he carved a small spiral into the beam above his bed. Not because he believed it would keep Samuel Hawthorne away, but because, somehow, he knew it would let him find his way back. By the third month of the deep winter, no one was counting the days anymore. The cold had a way of swallowing time, erasing the idea that spring was anything but a story people told to keep from going mad. The driver, older now, slower in his steps, had given up on leaving the Highlands. The roads were gone. The sky was a frozen lid. It was in the dead stillness between midnight and dawn that the knocking began. Slow, deliberate, 3 times. Then silence, 3 more. The sound carried through the way station's thick timbers, like it was coming from inside the walls. When the driver opened the door, the snow was waist deep, and standing in it, perfectly still, was Samuel Hawthorne. His coat was the same dark shade, unmarked by frost. The strange boots left their precise geometric prints in the drift. His eyes, that unearthly pale, locked on the driver's. "You kept the mark," Hawthorne said, his voice calm, almost approving. "That means you're ready." The driver's hand went instinctively to the beam above his bed. The carved spiral was still there, its grooves filled with dust. He didn't remember stepping aside, but somehow Hawthorne was inside now, moving with the same unhurried certainty he'd had in Milbrook. "There's no town this time," Hawthorne said, setting his satchel on the table. "No barns, no gatherings. The storm is too deep. This time, we begin where it ends." From the satchel, he drew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He unrolled it carefully, revealing 12 new spirals, each carved from something darker than wood, heavier than stone. When Hawthorne set one in the driver's palm, it was warm, almost pulsing. "Feed the strong," Hawthorne whispered, "and you will never fear the cold again." Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it a faint sound, not quite a howl, not quite a voice. The driver turned toward the window. In the swirling snow, he thought he saw other shapes moving between the trees, watching, waiting. When he looked back, Hawthorne was gone. Only the spirals remained on the table, lined up like an invitation. The driver knew then. The deep winter was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of his. It came to the driver in fragments, never all at once. Not a confession from Hawthorne, but a pattern. Glimpses in the way the man moved, the words he chose, the silences he left for others to fill. The first piece was in the sound of the wind that night. It wasn't the voice of the storm. It was layered, textured, as though many voices were calling from inside it. Some high, some low, some broken and ragged. He recognized a few. Keene, Mrs. Fairchild, even Rourke. Their tones rose and fell together, an endless, mournful hum. The second piece came when the driver touched the spiral again. For a heartbeat, his vision shifted. The room dimmed, and the air grew thick and weightless, like water. Shapes emerged in the corners, faces half-formed, eyes wide, mouths moving silently. Their edges rippled like they were carved from ice and shadow. He realized they weren't ghosts in the way stories tell it. They were inside him now, inside the wood, inside Hawthorne. The third piece was the memory, one that wasn't his. A frozen plain under a black sky. Cities like glass spires, glowing from within. People without names, their faces blurred, standing in silence around fires that burned cold. And in the center of them all, Hawthorne, unchanged, as if no time had passed between then and now. The understanding was sudden, absolute. Hawthorne wasn't a traveler in the way people thought. He wasn't from another place in the world. He was from another season in it. One that came before men walked here. One that still exists somewhere far beyond the reach of sunlight. And every deep winter, the barrier between seasons thins. The cold isn't the danger. It's the invitation. When the driver came to himself, the spirals were still on the table, their carved grooves catching the dim light. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows, and in its voice, he heard Hawthorne whisper, "Feed the strong, keep the balance, and when the season turns, you will walk with me." The driver didn't sleep. He didn't eat. By morning, one of the spirals was missing. By the fourth day of the storm, the way station had become a tomb. The walls moaned under the weight of snow. The firewood pile was nearly gone. The traders who had arrived before the blizzard now spoke in whispers, watching the driver with uneasy eyes. They didn't know about the spiral under his coat. They didn't hear the soft, steady beat it gave off at night, like a second heart. They didn't feel the pull in their bones when the wind carried Hawthorne's voice. That evening, one of the traders, a boy barely 20, collapsed from the cold, His breath was shallow, his skin pale. The others argued about whether to risk going out for help. The driver didn't speak. He knew help wouldn't come. Not from the lowlands, not from anywhere in the living world. In the quiet that followed, he heard it again. Feed the strong, not in his ears, in his blood. He rose, the spiral warm in his hand, and stepped toward the boy. Hawthorne was in the corner now, barely visible in the gloom, his pale eyes steady, the corners of his mouth turned upward. Not a smile, but a recognition. The driver knelt. The spiral's grooves seemed to sink into the boy's skin without breaking it. The breath that left the boy's lips was visible, a faint cloud that didn't fade, but coiled into the spiral, like smoke into a bottle. The boy's chest stilled. Warmth spread through the driver's fingers, up his arm, filling the hollows in him that years of winter had carved out. He felt stronger, clearer. He looked to the corner, but Hawthorne was gone. Only his voice remained, drifting in the wind. You've begun. The driver sat back, the spiral heavier now, as if it carried more than its own weight. Outside, the storm grew louder, but it no longer sounded hostile. It sounded like a road opening. And for the first time since Milbrook, the driver felt no need for spring. On the 7th night, the storm broke. Not in the way winter storms usually die, tapering into silence, but all at once, as if the wind had drawn a single, last breath and then let it go. The air outside was still, the sky an unnatural shade between silver and black. The snow underfoot was smooth, untouched, and it glowed faintly, as though lit from beneath. The traders stayed inside, afraid of what they saw through the windows. The driver did not. The spiral was hot in his hand now, pulsing faster than his own heartbeat. Each beat seemed to pull him forward, toward the tree line. And there, between the black trunks, Samuel Hawthorne waited. He was not dressed for the cold. His coat hung open, revealing a pale shirt that stirred in a wind the driver could not feel. His eyes were brighter now, not reflecting light, but casting it. You've fed the strong, Hawthorne said, and in his voice was the sound of rivers breaking free of ice, of glaciers shifting in their sleep. Now you walk with me. The driver stepped into the trees, and the world changed. The snow was deeper here, but it did not slow him. Above, the sky was wrong. No stars, only vast, moving shapes like clouds seen from beneath a frozen sea. In the distance rose towers of translucent ice, impossibly tall, bending with the horizon as though the land itself curved away. Shapes moved between those towers, tall, narrow figures, their faces hidden, their limbs too long to belong to men. Some wore spirals around their necks, carved from the same dark substance as his own. When they turned toward him, he felt no fear, only belonging. Hawthorne placed a hand on his shoulder. It was cold, but not the cold of winter, the cold of something untouched by the sun since the first dawn. This is the season before men, Hawthorne said. It is not gone, it only sleeps, and when the snow calls, we wake. The drive. R looked back once. Through the trees, far away, he saw the way station buried in drifts, its windows dark. Then the wind rose again, and the path behind him closed. He walked on. Somewhere far above, unseen, the deep winter turned over in its slumber and smiled.